Today I'll be talking about El Paso during World War II and the post-war years. Fort Bliss has grown incredibly since it first started in the mid-1800s. It now has about 1.2 million acres, and it covers both West Texas and southern New Mexico. Here's some photos of Fort Bliss over the years. On the left is Fort Bliss in the 1800s. In the middle is a meeting of General John J. Pershing, who is the man on the right, with Pancho Villa in the middle. And on the right is an aerial photo of Fort Bliss in the 1960s. During World War II, Fort Bliss was a center for anti-aircraft artillery training. It also housed about 91 prisoners of war, mostly Italian and German, although there were some Japanese from Hawaii. And during World War II, Fort Bliss, because of the increasing numbers of soldiers, was an even greater contributor to the economy of both El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. Remember that during the Depression, tourism in Juarez, which had been a mainstay of the economy, declined because of the economic crisis. World War II and the coming of so many soldiers to Fort Bliss reinvigorates that economy again as soldiers start to spend their free time in Juarez. I'd like you to read this article about the men of Company E. Company E was sent to combat in Italy, where they passed away in battle. The men in this company were almost entirely from WWII High School. And here is a bronze monument to them, which was unveiled in 2008. So I want you to continue to think about monuments and statues, because I'm going to show you another statue in a minute. An important part of military history and of the history of Fort Bliss is the presence of buffalo soldiers. Many people don't know about buffalo soldiers. In 1866, Congress created infantry and cavalry units comprised totally of African American soldiers, and they came to be known as the Buffalo Soldiers. It's said that when Native Americans first saw black soldiers, they thought that their hair looked like buffalo fur, and they called them Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers were used in the western part of the United States extensively against Native people. And here's where I want you to think again about commemoration, statues, monuments. The photo on the right is called The Errand of Corporal Ross. And this is John Ross. It represents John Ross, who is on a campaign against the Apaches in the late 1800s. And this memorial was erected in 1999 on post in Fort Bliss. So what do we think about this statue? So what was the effect of World War II on Ciudad Juarez? Higher demand for raw goods. Remember that I said that war is good for the economy because as men, and I'm saying men specifically because of the time period, are drawn into the military, they need things like uniforms and food and armaments. There's also a growing need for workers, again, because as the men go into the military either through draft or volunteering, they are leaving jobs back home. And in Juarez, tourism is reinvigorated. Remember that I told you that tourism was a mainstay of the economy of Juarez by the 1920s, but then in the 1930s, it dies out because of the Great Depression. It comes back to life during World War II because of the many, many soldiers at Fort Bliss who are now crossing the border to enjoy themselves in Juarez. As World War II was coming to an end, the United States wanted to make sure that this country had the hand up on technology, on biochemical warfare, on building rockets. So a covert operation began to bring German scientists to the United States in order to work for the US government. So right as the war is ending and into the post-war years, there is this secret operation that comes to be called Operation Paperclip that brings about 1,600 German scientists and their families to the United States in order to work for the US government. Some of these had been Nazis, some of them were still Nazi supporters, and although Truman had forbidden the government from bringing any Nazis or bringing any Nazi supporters as part of this operation, the government ignored him because they felt it was more important to get this scientific knowledge before the Soviet Union got the knowledge. Even though the Soviet Union and the United States were allies during World War II, it was very clear that that would not last very long. So the US was in this race to beat the Soviet Union technologically, and Operation Paperclip was part of this race. About 104 German scientists and their families were brought to El Paso, and here's a photo of them at Fort Bliss. Many of them settled in what is now Central El Paso. Their kids went to Russ School, went to Crockett School, and it became controversial many years later when it was known because we brought in Nazis to work for the government without them having been charged with any crimes. Remember that I told you about the coming of wide-scale agriculture to El Paso after the building of Elephant Butte Dam in the 1910s. Cotton becomes the main crop of the lower valley, especially with irrigation now available. And cotton requires a lot of manual labor, at least back then in the 40s, 50s, 60s. It required a lot of manual labor. The Bracero program provided this labor to pick cotton. You remember from the videos in the Bracero program that this was a temporary work program created through a contract between the United States and Mexico, starting in 1942 and ending in 1964. 4.6 million contracts are given out by the US government to bring men specifically to work in the fields. So the lower valley became very dependent on Bracero labor by the late 1940s. And let me give you some examples of the influence of agricultural employers. In 1952, there was something called the El Paso incident. It's not the only time it happened. It also happened in 1948, that there was no Bracero program briefly, as the United States and Mexico renegotiated the contract. Cotton is a crop that has to be picked immediately when it's ready. If you leave cotton in the fields after it's already opened, it rots. So it's very important to pick it right away. Well, it so happened that in the 1948 incident and the 1952 incident, that the contract negotiations broke down at cotton picking time. And the employers in the lower valley were desperate. Because of their influence, they were able to make a deal with immigration officials to allow thousands of Mexican men who were also desperate because they were waiting on the other side of the border for the Bracero program to start. So to allow thousands of Mexican men to cross the river, get arrested by immigration, and eventually be paroled to the agricultural employers to work for them. I told you a while back that there's an interesting contradictory relationship between the U.S. and Mexican labor. Well, this is an example of it. Agricultural employers are so powerful that they are able to make these deals with the federal government. They are able to make these deals with immigration officials to use the system to get Mexican workers to pick cotton. Let's say a word about politics. I've told you earlier that El Paso was a democratic city. Remember when the KKK arrived, that their power didn't last very long because the Democratic Party needed the Mexican-American vote? The Democratic Party in Texas had what was called the white-only primary. Texas, in those years, was a democratic state. It didn't become a Republican state until much later in the 20th century. Texas then is a democratic state, so it's known that whoever wins the primary election to run as the Democratic nominee will be the person who's elected. The Democratic Party had a white-only primary policy, which meant that only white people could vote. This, in effect, disenfranchises African American voters because their vote does not count. Dr. Lawrence Nixon changed all of this. Dr. Lawrence Nixon was born in East Texas. He was a physician, and he ended up coming to El Paso during the 1910s because he was seeing so many lynchings in his town of Marshall, Texas. In Marshall, Texas, the newspapers even declared, and I'm using their words, war on the Negroes. In order to escape that threat, to escape that violence, he came to El Paso and started his medical practice here and was very beloved. He was very beloved by people in South El Paso. So he came here, and you have a picture here of Dr. Nixon and his wife Drusilla Nixon in the 1930s. She too was very beloved. She was a music teacher, and she helped organize women's organizations, and both of them were civil rights leaders. Both of them were part of the National Association for Colored People, the NAACP. So in the 1940s, Dr. Nixon went to vote in the Democratic Party. And actually, the building where he voted is on Texas Street, and now it's a tire company. So he went to vote there, and they denied him because of the white-only primary. And it was a Mexican-American who denied him the right to vote. So he sued, and eventually, because of his legal challenges, it was done away with. I'd like to talk now about two men who were mayor of El Paso in the 1950s, and I chose them because I think they're two men that you would have heard about. One is Fred Hervey. Fred Hervey was mayor in El Paso 2 times in the 1950s, 1 time in the 1970s. And why I think you might know something about him is because I am sure you have gone to a Circle K store for gasoline, for a soda, for cigarettes. Fred Hervey was born in El Paso. He went to El Paso High School, and he founded the Circle K stores, which are now an international corporation. And he also founded the Oasis restaurants. And there is still one that I know of on Pershing. So Fred Hervey represents the homegrown businessman mayor. Raymond Diaz is the first Mexican-American mayor of a major U.S. city. And he too is mayor of El Paso for 2 terms in the 1950s. But he came from a more political background. He had been elected county clerk in the late 1940s, and then he ran for mayor, and he was backed by what was considered a very progressive group of Euro-American politicians and power brokers. He later became the ambassador to Costa Rica, so he had a very successful political career, very successful government career. So contrasting backgrounds, Diaz with a political career, Fred Hervey with a very successful business career. He also founded banks and served on the board of directors of large businesses. But very emblematic, I think, of El Paso in the 1950s. If we look at the post-war years, if we look at the 1950s and 1960s in El Paso, we find a city that is in many ways prospering, and Fort Bliss definitely adds to that economic prosperity. Many of the men who returned from World War II were able to get jobs at Fort Bliss through the civil service. You also have the Cold War going on. And the Cold War is a propaganda war against the Soviet Union. Cold wars are also good for the economy, even though they are not military wars. We have the maquiladora industry starting in Juarez, which provides jobs to managers who live in El Paso, even though they're often brought from other cities. This photo right here from the 1960s is what I remember downtown El Paso to be like when I was a kid growing up in the 60s. So you have veterans getting jobs, you have the GI Bill, which allows many men, and I'm saying men because it's mostly men who are in the military, allows many men to get education, and it allows families of veterans to buy homes. You have the opening of the first shopping centers, like Bassett Center was a big deal. You had Sunrise Center. You had Northgate Center in the Northeast. So all of this is expanding business to other parts of town away from downtown. But you find a very, very vibrant kind of city in the 1950s and 1960s.